Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. And I thank you for attending this webinar on techniques for strategic thinking and planning. We are going to proceed into some administrative type things. Just a few notes. We are recording the webinar, and there'll be a link to view the replay within 48 hours. You'll receive a copy of that link based on your registration email. You will also have access to a PDF copy of the webinar slides that you can use, download, and to review. And we're going to use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to ask questions. And I'm accompanied by my colleague, Candace Raymer, who is watching the Q&A box in the back side of the process. And we will get to the Q&A questions at the very end of the webinar. And if the process worked like it did on the first one this morning earlier, we should have plenty of time to take some of those. But for those that we don't get to, we will send you an email answering your question based on that you posed in the Q&A box. My background is working continuously for 48 years as of 2021. And started out 13 years with the Milwaukee School of Engineering University, which was culminated by my position of Senior Vice President of Administration, and then moved on to the IBM Corporation in 1985 through 2009. And that period from 85 through the rest of the 80s and 90s was one of high technology innovation and changes to what we were doing in the information processing world. I got introduced to artificial intelligence and knowledge-based systems at that time, and knew that we were eventually going to be where we are today, where the capabilities of the hardware met the capabilities of the software. And that's why you have things like Watson and other AI type capabilities that are there today. In '89, for a year, I was at the Executive in Residence program at the Plug and Play Tech Center in Sunnyvale, where they have anytime 250, 260 tech startups in the Bay Area under their locations. And started working for the Strategy Management Group Balanced Scorecard Institute in 2010. And since that time, I've completed 75 client consulting, internal training, and advisor engagements to date. Prior to joining the Institute, while I was at IBM, I was doing IBM and departmental scorecards. And so I stopped counting at 100. And it was pretty prolific as I went through that period. I'm a lifelong learner. Got my MBA late in life, 2005, and finished up my doctoral core classes about 2008, 2009. And now all I have to do is finish the dissertation work, which is becoming a hurdle since I'm busy as all get out, so to speak. So let's talk about these statements. Your organization gathers at the end of every year, fourth quarter, or right before, planning for the budget for next year, and goes through a review of the strategy, and, maybe executives, maybe yourself, goes off into a meeting for a couple of offsite sessions for a couple of days, and you go through the same process and the same tools, and unfortunately, you kind of get those two Post-it notes off to the right. You got the same old thinking and the same old results is what results. And that's one of the reasons why we're been working with clients to get into this business of different types of future thinking and how it affects your strategy going forward. I don't think there's anyone here that can deny that the pandemic and economic times, if you haven't been doing any thinking about the future, you're going to start doing things thinking about the future, because these techniques that we're going to cover today could provide a safety valve for your strategy and the outcomes going forward. Because I don't think the pace of change and the various changes around that we've had, not only with pandemics, but with other international and domestic changes going through, that your business model is going to be under duress, again, based on technology and social changes that bring it to your organization's landscape periphery, and impacts how it does business and how it is successful or not. And the other thing is that that analysis is going to maybe be driven by the fact that you have to maybe change your model so that you're in a defensive position or offensive. I mean, the last thing you want to be is in a heavy defensive, because then I like to say the enemy is inside the gates. So what are you going to do now? And offense, it's always better to be on the offense and having others follow you as opposed to you following another organization that you have to go through. So consequently, for those organizations that are not doing future thinking and planning, uh, they're going to have to start. And it's mainly because of what Gary Hamel says in this particular slide. The problem with the future is that it is different. If you are unable to think differently, the future will always arrive as a surprise. And I'll add to that that you will have the future will do to you what maybe your competitors will do to you, because they have been thinking about the future going forward and its relationship to your strategic plan and your strategic plan execution. So the techniques that we're going to cover over the next series of webinars, and this is all part of the Balanced Scorecard Institute Strategic Management Maturity Model, which has 8 dimensions, one of which is strategic thinking and planning. We're going to introduce you to some of the work we've done on these particular 3 areas. Scenario planning, which should be a big driver in getting you thinking about how your strategy's got to change. Yeah, and then a heavy dose of strategic foresight analysis, which really does get into a much more almost research-like environment where you're looking for every signal, every probable change, every possibility, all data, a lot of intensive data collection that's related to the questions or what you need to find out about where your company is now in relationship to what's going on to the rest of the world. And then also take a look at this thing called inflection point analysis, which is that point in time in your business when something has changed and you either better change with it, or you could be faced with you're now behind the curve and you may not survive being behind the curve. And let's do some, I always do in these webinars where I need to some what I call textbook definitions. Now, the first thing you're going to find if you do some research on resources for scenario planning, because it's been around a lot of years, you're going to find that there's a lot of different textbooks, a lot of different white papers, Harvard Business Review papers, Sloan Management Review papers on this. And you're going to find when you dig into those that they all have a different approach that they use to how they conduct scenario planning. And later on in this presentation, I will get into a little bit more detail about how the Balanced Scorecard Institute does strategic scenario planning with its clients. But it's basically you're looking at how you anticipate and manage change. And that could be in any number of landscapes. Is it environmental? Is it political? Is it technological, which is a heavy hitter these days? But the thing is, you're going to ask a strategic question, at least from our perspective and our process, a strategic question for your business today. And we typically take clients through one question. We come to consensus with the executive team and those that are being charged with conducting this scenario planning, what that strategic question means and what it is. And what you're trying to do is link futures thinking with your strategic action. In fact, we don't stray away from doing that linkage. You can definitely use scenario planning in just about any realm. It doesn't have to be connected to a strategy, but from our institute's perspective, it always is connected. The outcomes from the scenario session is connected directly to the potential update and change to your strategic plan, balanced scorecard, whatever it might be that's your guide going forward. And as it says in the last sentence, any strategic planning or strategizing without scenario thinking is more or less pointless, because you can go back to that bullet from the previous two slides where you go to that fourth quarter deep dive and you just do the same thing and the same thing and the same thing and nothing changes. This is going to get you in the mode of thinking about what needs to change in that plan going forward. The next is strategic foresight analysis. Now, its close cousin that some of you may have heard of is the VUCA enigma, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And this, as I categorized when I first showed you that icon with the three different techniques, this is the heavy lifting, because you're going to be required to do some real deep diving research into databases, article databases, and ferreting out as much intelligence as you can. You're literally an intelligence gatherer of what the possible, plausible, and probable futures are that you can come up with based on your data collection, and then develop a preferred future. Of course, when you get done with this, you're going to connect this back to your strategy again and what you might have to change. And believe me, you will find out, as I've highlighted in the second paragraph, you're going to find out we do not know what we do not know now. And so consequently, you're going to find things out that might be even a surprise to your organization if it hasn't done something like this before. And this puts to bed, as far as I'm concerned, the conventional strategic planning processes that have become tired, and they rarely produce really truly innovative and futures ready strategy. So again, you're going to tie this back to your strategy plan or balanced scorecard, whatever you use to drive your business forward. Now, this inflection point analysis, and this really goes back to Andy Grove and Intel back in 1999. Where he just says it's a point in time in the life of the business where the red arrow, the business is going, the industry is going in a red arrow direction, and you're still going in the white arrow directions. And these could be signals which you will pick up in the prior process of strategic foresight. You will start to pick those signals up. And this is where these two kind of blend together, but they can still stay separate. And really could be a huge signal on the horizon about what you need to change, and change now or be gone later on. And Rita McGrath, a very, very good writer and proposer of things like inflection point analysis, the death of competitive analysis, and those types of things. It's where you're going to shift the elements of your activities, throwing certain taken for granted assumptions into question. Now, we all know some of those examples in this case that hit an inflection point and did not pay attention to it. The one that comes to mind from my era, because I'm a little bit older probably than most of you in this audience, is Kodak. I grew up in the Kodak world where the film was in the canister, you stuck it in the camera, turned the crank, and started taking pictures. Well, we know the results of that when digitalization came on, and things like digital cameras and that type of apparatus and innovations, and Kodak tried, but was too far behind the curve. They actually had a digital camera for some time, and but it was too late. It was an innovation they put in place that they should have been seeing through foresight analysis and inflection point analysis. Another one was Blockbuster versus Netflix. Blockbuster, for those of you who are old enough, you remember you went to the store, you picked up the VHS or the beta cartridges, you rented them, you brought them back. Hopefully you brought them back on time and you didn't have to pay a penalty. And, along comes Netflix using the technology of digital and CDs and DVDs. And the next thing you know is that there's no place in the industry for Blockbuster. And of course, Netflix took it to its extreme, because they not only was going to be the purveyor of the product that you would take back to watch at your convenience, but they also got into the production process, and now have, as you know, their own channels on cable networks and that type of thing. And they produce their own movies, etc. So it's keeping an eye on what's going on in the periphery around you that's going to drive your business in a different direction, is what inflection point analysis is all about. Now, to get started in any of these three techniques, you need to have a strategy. Sure, you could be just like you landed on the planet yesterday and you have no strategy, but you like some things you see and you start doing scenario analysis, but it's just an exercise, and it might help you in some research area say that, oh, we should go in this direction. But at the end of the day, we have to have businesses that are going concerns, and you have to link all of that output to your strategy going forward. So this kind of is a categorization of what strategy is made up of. And then in the full story is the last two layers on the pyramid. So you have to start out with things like customer stakeholder needs, customer value proposition, values of the organization, your mission vision, your organizational views of performance or perspectives. Some organizations have goals, priorities, themes, and results. And then you create those strategic objectives or goals, and you put a strategy map together to test the logic between the objectives. But this is the beginning, is a necessary evil, so to speak, that has to be in place before you can intelligently use the outcome from any three of those techniques that I showed before. Then you can put on KPIs and targets and measures to the objectives, and also create measures or projects or initiatives to help those objectives be successful going forward. In fact, most of those techniques will help you identify projects and initiatives that you must put in place related to your strategy, like that inflection point analysis. If your industry is going in some direction that you're not, you may need to make that change quickly, and that's going to require resources and investment that will help you attach that to your strategy. The other thing is you're going to have to go back to help you look at the tools that you use to create a strategy. And one of the first things that you're going to have to do in all three of these is you're going to have to understand who your customers and stakeholders are. If you don't understand who your customers and stakeholders are to the nth degree, and you don't measure that or assess it every year, that's usually the process that's done in that fourth quarter strategy resolution. My clients tell me that their customer value proposition and their SWOT analysis are the things that they look at, because it changes from year to year, and that change is accelerating. And so customers, stakeholders, customers, those are the people that buy your goods and services. They're your revenue stream. Your stakeholders are that group of people that have an interest in how well your organization works. So if you're taking a look at a particular scenario of, what is the business landscape going to look like in 2022, you're going to have to assess through a series of assumptions, certainties and uncertainties, relationship to who your stakeholders and customers are, because they are your lifeblood of your organization's revenue stream. And the products and service attributes, this is all about the feature functions of what you produce. I don't care if it's a product or a service. Are you doing it in a quality manner? Are you making the on time, on delivery, getting it when they want it? And of course, are you providing it at the price that they are likely to go with your firm? Of course, you have to measure as best you can your image and relationship. But these things, through all three of those techniques, are going to show up in the analysis that you have to do. The others are doing a strategy profile. The one in the upper left is for a for-profit organization. And the reason you know that is because the x-axis elements, and you can see that that's the customer value proposition elements in the x-axis, they're market differentiators. For-profit businesses duke it out with members of their competition amongst those particular aspects on that x-axis. It could be others, it could be any number on there. The value profile or the strategy profile on the right is for a nonprofit or government agency. It's all about value factors. I mean, we know that in the nonprofit world, you can't be insanely ending up with profits or excess cash, because the You were given the opportunity to be a nonprofit organization, and that brings with it certain requirements from a financial aspect based on taxation. So value is what you're delivering, and this happens to be a passport office that put their value factors, those elements that are on the x-axis. Yes, a SWOT analysis is still a good tool to use, and in fact, when I work with my clients on SWOT analysis, I'm very specific about individual contribution. I do not like group head nodding, duck head nodding in a SWOT analysis session, because you never get everybody's input. You do it individually, you get a lot of good data to take a look at. And remember, that internal group weaknesses, as far as, and again, this is something that I've discovered over the years of doing SWOTs. If you're doing a strategy or you're doing something to change based on an inflection point or a strategic foresight, you better be pay attention to the challenges of a SWOT analysis. And the challenges are weaknesses and threats. You're not going to stop doing your strengths. You're going to chase every opportunity that you can get. But those internal things like weaknesses and those external things that could be done to you as a threat, you're going to want to really get your arms around that and design strategy around what you do. So that's perfect for some of these strategic thinking and analysis, because you're talking about the futures here. You're going to do a pestle analysis because a lot of the world is interlinked to things like economic, environment, and legal, and social is changing. And of course, technology is changing. Innovation keeps up its heavy duty pace going forward, and political aspects change. The other thing that you're probably going to have to get used to is a five forces model. And the reason being that, and I don't care if you're in the for-profit or nonprofit world, the threat of substitutes is major these days, because with the churn in the economy and the changes in the technology, where you had the upper hand at any point in time in the history or currently, we like to say in Silicon Valley that that kid in the garage next door is going to one up you on something, and you'll never see it coming unless you're testing through foresight, intelligence gathering, what that kid's doing next door. The perfect example of substitutes is just ask Gillette in Mach 3. Those of you, the guys, you knew that was it about 4 or 5 years ago. That's what you went and got. Well, now you can get a substitute threat to Gillette, which is Harry's or the Dollar Shave Club. $1 for the handle, $1 per blade. And oh, by the way, you never have to step foot in a retail store. You can have it sent to you. Do you want a plastic handle? Do you want a stainless steel handle? Do you want it engraved, et cetera, et cetera? So Gillette never saw that coming. They had a 70% market share with the Mach 3, and it dropped to 40% the minute Harry's and Dollar Shave Club came on. And just to show you how powerful that substitution is, when Dollar Shave Club went public, the valuation after 1 year was $1 billion. Think about it, just a razor in your hand. And so this has consequences if you don't pulse those things through a foresight analysis or a inflection point analysis. So that's new entrants get covered there. Bargaining power of suppliers is always changing. The power of the customers. If they've got options to pick, there's no loyalty anymore in products and services. If your current clients, your current customers find something that meets those things in regards to the product attributes, those 4 attributes that they can get somewhere else, and it's half as much as cost, they're going to jump. So you have to put things in place in your strategy to make sure that you're keeping them and keeping your organization and your product services in front of them the way they need it and want it. And of course, it sets up competitive rivalry. Now, one of the things you're going to have to also get used to in this process is the horizons of strategic innovation. Now, I adapted this for our clients off of the text that was created in The Alchemy of Growth back in 1999. By the way, this particular concept, it was followed by IBM and is still followed by IBM today. Now, this particular one is for business and industry, so that says profit making. So you've got profit making, this profit performance is what they're looking for on the y-axis, but over a period of time, and in this case years, because some of these things take time to get in place. Horizon 1 is straightforward. This is your core business. You are extending and defending your core business, and then an innovation is moved into existing operations and market. How do you take what you build today and make some changes to it from a design and capability standpoint, and you offer the next model and the next model and the next model? Pretty straightforward. But when you want to move to Horizon 2, it's emerging businesses, something that's going to happen in addition to what you do now. And adjacent to that is the innovation, but in new but related areas to the business and markets that you have today. Typically, this is where you'll see holding companies pick up other lines of business that provide services and products that you don't have now as the base company. And of course, out on the fringe is this is really out on the fringe. It's transformative because these things don't exist today. You are investing in the future. So there's quite a bit of investment here, but the results from a foresight analysis and a inflection point analysis is going to clearly start pointing you in the direction of Horizon 3. And by the way, if you listen to places, business channels or financial channels like MSNBC or Bloomberg, or even some of the financial news network, you're going to hear the commentators talk and refer to companies as Horizon 1, 2, or 3. They'll say they're a Horizon 3 company. This stuff that they're working on is not even available in the marketplace yet. So that's what those Horizon statements are talking about. Interestingly enough, if you start out with these questions, starting from the bottom to the top, this is how you actually start a scenario analysis, is you come to consensus on how and where could we expand into new geographies. And then you're going to see what we do is we ask them based on the question that and then of course they looked at a number of questions, but then we ask them to say, what are the assumptions that we can make about that statement based on our organization? And then what are we certain about in those assumptions, and what are we uncertain about? And that gets into the pestle side of things. What is it that's going to drive that question not to be successful, or that probable future to be successful? That process works very well, and I like it because it gets a lot of people involved. At the end of last year, we went through one client that had 58 individuals in roughly 7 or 8 Zoom breakout rooms doing a scenario analysis based on a series of questions, a question that we settled on that they could take a look at and come up with assumptions and certainties and uncertainties. And eventually they created a change to their strategy going forward for 2021. Actually, it's over a series of years, I believe 3 years, 21 to 24. You can do the same thing in government and nonprofit as well. I mean, the thing here is that it's programs and service reach effectiveness. I'm working with one client now where we're talking about the delivery of existing operations and programs as a core, so that everyone in this group that I'm working with understands what they are. And Horizon 2 is getting those programs and services cost effective. That's a simple change that they can look at, but maybe they didn't do it going forward. And then transformative, which is on the innovation to solve the problems with new solutions. In their case, in this one, there is a nonprofit, but they're starting to get competition from other nonprofits in the same industry space. And that becomes a problem because they want to have to act like a profit, but they're within boundaries based on their nonprofit status. So they have to get very strategic about how they keep ahead of that competition going forward. Series of same questions, except now they're more looked at the stakeholder needs. Other stakeholder groups are partnering. In fact, we just had the discussion today about partnering that they have to go out through, and the delivery systems. I mean, how do you have to do better delivery of your services and goods that you can move out to from a nonprofit and a government side. And by the way, it's important from the government side because if you find that you have nonprofits or some other services in your organization or your geographic area for your government, the government sooner or later going to say, you know, that company over there, they provide the same services and products that we do, but they do it for about 50% less cost. Why are we wasting budget money having you guys do it as an agency? We'll just swing the business over there with them and create a contract, create a service level agreement, done. And that gets the government to free up more funds to use in a different area. So how do we do this and what is our methodology going forward? Well, first we have to start with that series of gears on the left, which is strategic performance review. These are series of scheduled at a regular basis meetings and analysis of your current strategy. And I remember going back, I said, you got to have that strategy going forward. So in this case, it starts with the programs and projects, mainly because we found over the years that if there's any fault line in any strategy of any nature, of any company, I don't care if it's nonprofit, government, or for-profit, they're usually somewhat mediocre for the most part in execution and completing their projects and programs on time, on budget, and realizing the benefits that they were supposed to get out of those projects. So that requires more rigorous review. And we started out with a monthly process. I had one client that had this so far in the tank, they had to change these programs and projects meetings to weekly over a series of 3 or 4 months before they got them back on track. Quarterly review sessions of the strategy itself, all those components that you saw in the pyramid, they take a look at all of those to make sure that they're still valid and executing the way they were supposed to be designed to work. And then the fourth quarter is a deep dive. It goes back to that first slide about the scenario of, you know, here's the same old thing that goes through every fourth quarter. And you take apart a lot of those, and that's where I mentioned that you'll look at the customer value proposition and the SWOT analysis with some detail. But now we want to take that as inputs and put it in play through adding in the order that I've got there, scenario planning, strategic foresight analysis, and inflection point analysis. The reason being is that in scenario planning, that can usually be done on a pretty rapid basis based on the fact that you have a strategy in place. And you may want to look at just one aspect of the strategy through that primary question, making the assumptions, making analysis of what's certain and what's uncertain, and then create the scenario after that. But of course, you'll feed that back to now an updated strategy. It's on the right. But a lot of things that are in that scenario planning may be useful into the strategic foresight analysis, which is more intelligence gathering of a data side, as well as quantitative and qualitative data that you'll bring into that analysis. And then, of course, the minute you start digging into that foresight analysis, you'll start to see where there's potential inflection points coming on. Because let's say you pick a data source that is really out on the fringe, and what they're reporting is that something that's very specific to your organization is going to be changing in the next 12 to 15 months. That is something you need to put into your inflection point analysis process. And the whole thing ends up with, over a year basis, you're not doing this every month, by the way. You have to get the right cadence for yourself. But you're going to come up with an updated corporate strategy in play. And then the next year, the next fiscal year, you just start over again while you're conducting based on the schedule of the strategic performance reviews going forward. Why is all of this a critical success factor? And what it lends to in terms of your organization. And I renamed this title, also known as How to Protect Your Investment in Your Strategy Plan. It's all about protecting your strategy and making sure your strategy doesn't come under duress from a competitor that's got something going on that's causing an inflection point, but it's also allowing you to look into the future so that when something like the next pandemic comes to the surface, you're ready to weather it maybe better than you did now. And I'm not saying that it wasn't weathered well now, but a lot of organizations went under duress and were almost starstruck to the point where they couldn't get moving and keep things moving. And you've seen the results of that around the world and the world's economies. Keeping the leadership engaged, very critical. And that's in leadership, by the way, at all levels. It's not just the executives. It could be directors, it could be managers, it could be supervisors, it could be team leaders. They all have to understand what their role is in keeping that strategy and the future aspects in front of every employee going forward. You have to ramp up the strategy communications. By the way, that's another fault line, along with not able to execute projects on time and on budget. But a lot of organizations do some communications and then go silent while the rank and file or the employee base starts to say what's going on with with the strategy. We don't hear anything about it anymore. Same thing with this in relationship to the future aspects of these three techniques. You're going to use the results that come out to modify your plan, your strategic plan, and use the data that comes out of those KPIs that are assigned to those objectives. And you're going to get your project management skills in line. This is a long-term commitment. You're talking about doing probable and plausible futures out a ways. And so this is no short-term move here. You're probably going to have something that lasts at least a year or 2 years long, and then you get it implemented over that period of time. And of course, you have to have motivated behaviors for the individual employees and teams, because they're the ones that are going to have to implement some of the things that you put in place to your strategy from either of the three techniques on looking into the future. Let's take a look at scenario planning now. And this is the why. Why do you do scenario planning? Well, I think we made the case for uncertainty and predictability already. You want to explore possible future outcomes based on that initial question and the assumptions that you make around that question. You can identify certainties and uncertainties, and then you follow the top level uncertainty and design a scenario around that that will help that change your strategy to meet that particular result of that question. This is the bigger one right here. It's the leveraging the creativity and points of view from various personnel. You would not believe how many organizations we go into, and when we sit on, I just ran one at the end of last year for about 58 individuals at what we call the departmental level. And they had their leader for that particular department and a lot of people at the departmental level. And it was so engaging, and it was almost like they were hungry for truth and direction, that I called up the strategist, it was my client, and I said, I got the feeling these people never been asked about this kind of thing before. And she said, yeah, we wondered when you were going to call, because that was evident. And I said, well, I thought we talked about this 6 months ago, that the managers were going to start bringing the messaging down to the individuals. And the answer was, we know, and we have to fix that. Of course you have to fix that. And in this case, they got the best ideas from these lower level people that were at the execution part of the organization. And the changing results on their strategy was phenomenal to keep them focused through the next year, because that question was only covering next year of 2021. They act as these guys now are ambassadors. They know how this stuff came about, and they can be inside communicators to the rest of the organization. And the nice thing about scenarios is typically no regret activities before you get into that investment stage, because you can make a change. In this case, their changes, they did have to make some investments on some of the infrastructure and some of the processes, but it was the right thing to do based on the conversations that took place after the session. This is how a typical planning session looks. So this is the how. I won't go over each of these buckets because I've already talked about many of them already, things like CVP, SWOT, defining a key question, and also things like, the external forces. We talked about 5 forces analysis and the assumptions, and then you have to develop the narratives, and then you analyze the certainties and uncertainties. And then the implications is that you're going to go back and make some changes to your strategy plan and probably do some additional research. But more importantly, outcome from this will probably drive you into strategic foresight analysis, which is a real deep dive into intelligence gathering from there. 5 forces, pretty straightforward. The biggest one today is substitute products and services. You can always find another product that's close to what you're using or what your customers can use, and they may vacate you on a moment's notice. And that's why it's critical to watch what's going on. Plus, the disruptive technologies also lend themselves to substitute products. Up on the customer side, it's all about that customer value proposition and needs, what's changing there. And if you're in a situation where you're tied to a particular supply chain process, you better be prepared to be disrupted, because it is still being disrupted today. I mean, the disruption started well into June of last year. And I'll take an example because I'm a pretty frequent buyer on Amazon. Even Amazon has trouble with supply chains. And sometimes they'll say, well, you're a Prime member, you should get it the next day. But then what do I get? I get the message, it was delayed. You're going to have to wait 2 days. And well, that's a supply chain issue. So what's the problem downstream? Drivers, delivery, et cetera, because of the pandemic and that type of thing. Competitors are always changing in their actions. It could be mergers, divestitures, or change. But clearly, every industry is in churn right now. There's no question about it. And these things will help you focus on what you need to do from your organization. When we talk about scenario planning characteristics, I want to start with the nots. It's not an attempt to predict the future. It's an attempt to look at plausible the futures or possible. We're not doing any forecasting here. We're not doing any predicting. We're looking at plausible and possible futures, which of course, before you launch any ships or initiatives or projects, you have to get contingency and consensus on amongst the management team. It's not strategic contingency planning. It's not a forecast, and it's not doing simple versus good versus bad. What it is about is, can it be applied to a specific situation? Like that question I mentioned earlier. We asked about what the landscape would typically be looking like in 2021. And we created assumptions, and we also created certainties and uncertainties. And if you look at it, you can also use this on a regular basis to look at your own organization, inside your industry, and then the environment. So typically, another name for this is maybe a scan of what's going on in your market space or your industry space. Like I said, it's not forecasting. You know, there's a little graphic there, and all of us on this call has probably been asked to do forecasting about something related to sales or whatever, product sales, product requirements, and you have a plus or minus deviation, and that you look at and then you say this is the official future. Scenario analysis is literally coming to a series of divergent futures that may be stronger from A to B or C to D, but where you are right now, this is the direction that we need to move. And then to move that, you have to make a change in your strategy going forward. So the way we do this is we define the key question. You get the executives together to think about what they want to have their teams launched on, to take a look at, and you put the question down. Like in the case of the customer I just mentioned from the end of last year, the question, what's the business landscape likely to look like in 2021? And the teams came up with a series of assumptions, a series of certainties and uncertainties. And the way they got some of those was the gathering of the data. You know, they had just gotten done doing a review through the SWOT and PESTEL analysis. We touched a little bit on 5 forces, so they had that data fresh on their mind. And they said, you know, there were a number of things in that SWOT analysis that jumped right off the page into that question and was used to either validate or not validate the assumption based on the certainties and uncertainties that they had identified. Now you need to separate them. So you really got kind of a chart that's got the question on the top. You come down one level. Here's the assumptions, and there's a whole series. And then that branches off into certainties and uncertainties. And it's really about how confident you feel about some of your assumptions and certain trends. And by the way, through your analysis in the foresight strategic foresight, you're going to be looking for trends that are emerging. That's part of the research that you'll have to do. And you're going to, like I said, you keep two separate buckets, one certainties and uncertainties. And some might be important, others may not. Some of those uncertainties may be things out of your control. Remember on the SWOT analysis about those threats? Some of those certainties of a threat are going to show up as a certainty in your scenario planning. And do you have control on it or not? And if you don't, you have to design strategies to work around that so that you don't get caught short, especially on the inflection point analysis side of things. And then once you get those vetted out, and you're going to put your most important significant uncertainties at the top of the list, you're going to start taking a look at those and creating the story of the future around each that fuses your certainties with the outcome that you've chosen. And consequently, it's really a story scenario that you're looking at. We're not getting in any quantitative work here, but is it plausible and is it possible going forward? You don't do many scenarios because you're going to find out that if you just run wild through this step, you can create a lot of different ones and you'll hit diminishing returns about the outcome and the output. So a few reminders. We're recording this. It'll be available. And just a heads up that the next webinars in this series, now this series is based on an initial one that we did on the strategic management maturity model, of which strategic thinking and planning is one of the dimensions. And I'll talk about that on slide 28 in just a second. But the next, we're going to continue on with a little wrap up on scenario planning on the next webinar next month. And then we're going to, depending on how much time, we'll maybe start into foresight analysis and then use the next month to finish that off and then get into inflection point analysis. And depending on how we move through that, it might be the next 2 or 3 webinars, at best 3, going forward to get through the rest of these at a high level. And then typically what transpires next is, from what you've seen, I invite you to contact me and we can talk through a scenario or talk through what you're looking for. And then we can start getting down to the configuration size state that you want to use for your particular strategic thinking and planning. This next page on 28 talks about the strategic management maturity model. And you can go out and actually do this yourself at this link, and you'll get a great analysis along those 8 dimensions that are listed there. And we've already talked about what I talked about last month was alignment. So alignment's been done. That's aligning your strategy across your organization. And we're spending a lot of time in terms of strategic thinking and planning on these 3 techniques that I talked about here. So having said that, let me open up. Let's take a look here and see what's going on in Q&A. Okay, good question, Michael. What techniques do you use to keep the participants from saying that will never happen when considering possible scenarios? What I observed on a couple of sessions that I ran, both in person and virtual. The virtual one was end of last year, obviously. The in-persons were all prior to the pandemic. And what I saw was the interplay between the participants. You probably get away with somebody saying that will never happen only once. And then their own peer pressure from the group will start saying to those individuals, okay, if you say that will never happen, tell me why it will never happen. And in that, many times they'll stop using that term, or the explanation of why it will never happen, unfortunately, many times turns out to be pretty illogical compared to the organization that's going through. In good order, though, you might want to capture some of those things as a parking lot and part of the record, but it's pretty easy I've found through peer pressure to facilitate the naysayers, as I call it, into something that's more credible and contributory to a scenario session. Joe, I'm part of a 50,000 person international company. My function has 160 people. How do I apply these principles within your function? Good question. And you're right to start at smaller numbers and actually start at a function level or a department level. If you'd said department at 100, 150, 60 people, that would be good too as well. And but what I would recommend is if you've not done either three of these before, and you want to get started in that area, is to first, and I'm going to make the presumption here, Joe, also that you have a strategy management office or some office for an organization that large, and even for your department, that's monitoring and managing the strategy execution. You might want to start talking with those folks first about getting some input from these people in your organization, that how they feel about looking at what's going on in the future. Are they seeing that on the periphery of that function, they're seeing the company being taken or being sidestepped or end arounding by other competitors based on the function that's in that particular function? And are they willing to sit down and invest the time to think about it and meet as a group? Highly collaborative process all the way around. Noreen, as the word normal is now defined quite differently, change management and continuity planning are critical. You can say that again. What are the best strategies for addressing the abstracts, what ifs in scenario planning or other approaches for the organization? First of all, you need to get into the process of defining those what ifs and in a very structured manner to get them all going through and thinking. I hate to use this term because it's overused, but this is really what this is, outside the box. But in the case of the strategic foresight analysis, it's very data driven because you're doing a lot of intelligence gathering. And you can also, then you can bring back into various scenarios, looking at your strategy plan and fundamentally saying, Noreen, does our strategy take into account that scenario? And most cases I've seen, maybe one or two will say, yeah, it does. But all of a sudden, there are some scenarios that you've developed that there's no way it comes even close to taking on what you came out with for that strategic foresight analysis. So that forces them almost by default into making a change in the strategy, or at least considering it going forward. Freddie, Joe, in the analysis of the products and services, the first aspect is function. Can you explain it, please? Yes. In the case of that group I did with 58 on their most recent one, they had they looked at that question for the overall organizational strategy first. And then we had them break out from there and went down to their departmental level. So we started at the function level. I mean, it could be any of the function of the department or what it needs to be. So it all comes down to the groups that you have in place to handle those products and services and how you want to start them through the process and get them on board. Steve, how many different scenario plans does an organization typically need? Is there average or recommended range? Once again, you don't want to have too many, but the bigger thing, Steve, is you're going to find is as you get more, they may not have the attachability or the stickiness to your strategy that you need them to have. So that tells you they're a little weak on an attachment to your strategy. Typically, I've seen in petroleum industries, medical manufacturing capabilities, and in the case of financial institutions that we've done, it's the first 4 or 5 that usually are the strongest. Where on occasions I let them run with more strategy time because they wanted to, and I like the energy. Once you get the energy going, you don't like to suppress it, but I caution them at the very beginning that your high output's going to be your first 4 or 5 that look pretty decent, and then you're going to have diminishing returns after that. Let's see, Ariba, can you briefly review inflection point in the context of strategic planning for public sector that do a 3-year strategy plan? Well, first of all, kudos for doing a 3-year strategy plan, even in the public sector area. That's a definite in the for-profit, by the way, these days. I don't even talk about 10-year plans or 4 to 5 or 5 to 10. So 3 years is good. You have to sit down in the terms of the public sector. You really have to get down to those services that you produce for the citizens or for the community or for the country or whatever, and say, how is this service that we provide going to change in the next year, 2 years, and start that out with a basic scenario analysis. And so, because the scenario analysis is an easy entree into this whole business about futures, in my opinion, because you don't have to do a lot of data work unless you want to in terms of your stories that you come out with in the back. That's the next most typical thing that you do with the stories out the back of a scenario. So if you can get those folks to sit down and go through a process of thinking about, and you come up with that question or questions to drive the analysis, you will see very quickly in the public sector arena that there may be things that are going to change that you hadn't anticipated. If they've been doing some analysis of the outside world, there may be things they'll say, oh, wait a minute, this looks like it's viable, it's plausible, but there are other service delivery capabilities already in the domain. You can get this from a partner, you can get this from another business, and you don't have to fund it yourself. And especially in the public sector side, public sector is always hard looking for the budget reductions and budget lowering. And they basically have said to some departments that I've worked with in public sector, we want you to start doing this in a more business-like manner, even though never were thought of maybe 10 years ago. Just you got it from the main source of the budget, and that was it. But now even the entities that are having to manage and create the budgets are saying, you know what, we got to take a little bit more business acumen here, and they have to reduce costs. They have to make sure that they got the finances being used in the right area. And if that means farming out certain activities to another partner, that may be the case. And I think we've got time for one more here. Yvette, who are the key people that should be involved in strategic planning and foresight analysis? Well, first of all, Yvette, the first ones that should be, and this is my recommendation, because this is what I've used in the past with clients, the strategy management office, who has the task and the requirements to monitor the aspect of the strategic plan and the outcomes from all of these strategic objectives and priority areas. They're monitoring the projects. They're monitoring, the KPIs and collecting the data and making the reports and that type of thing. The reason being is that they are usually already ahead of the game on seeing what the results of the strategy plan is from going forward. Now, since those folks have typically been, and I'm going to presume for the moment, Yvette, that you have a fully aligned strategy. You don't have a strategy just at the corporate organization wide. You have a strategy that was built for corporate or organization-wide strategy, and that was aligned down to the departments and functions, and then eventually aligned and down to the teams and individuals in those departments. That's full alignment. Because you were involved with those folks going forward, they have a tremendous amount of data and capabilities of experience that they know within their specific function or domain. That almost goes back to that other question that was asked about function areas. They are on the front lines as to what goes on in their department or function. So they probably have a resource of a lot of intelligence data that you can gather and use in that foresight analysis going forward for that plan. And maybe one more here. Jay. Thank you very much, Jay. That's good. So first thing is, thanks for being here. And I think the key thing is don't be afraid to get started. And my recommendation is to get started with scenario planning first, because the key thing here, and I made the point in my slide earlier, is scenario planning and all of these techniques, for the most part, for all of them, especially scenario, it gets collaborative environment in place. And if you have reservations that you don't have a collaborative environment in place, I don't think there's any executive or manager that's not going to say, no, you can't do that because we don't collaborate. I think most managers and executives know that you don't move the organization forward unless there is collaboration. And I guess that's kind of a nice way of saying this whole process would help break down the silos as well, because it's based on your strategy. You're trying to strengthen and move your strategy over some period of time. If you got a 3-year strategy or a 2-year strategy, you're trying to move that in another direction, and you're going to move it by a group of executives going off to a retreat for 2-3 days at the end of the year, and then coming back and handing you the new strategy when no one else was included in that process. So it's going to force this function of collaboration. And once you get that barrier down, you're going to find that you're going to see a lot of information come out from those groups going forward. I really appreciate your time on this webinar, and you'll be hearing from us for any questions that we didn't get to. And please stay in touch. And, I look forward to hearing from any of you if you have any questions. And if it's just a scheduled call to say, what about this? How can I do that? I'm very happy to do that as well. So have a great rest of your day, evening, afternoon, and hope to see you on February webinar, starting to finalize with strategic scenario planning, and then also starting to get into foresight analysis. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you soon, and stay well and stay safe.